So if I were to take a cross section of a skeletal muscle, so let's say that I had like a biceps brachii here, and I actually slice it up. There's my cross section. And then I take those fibers and put them under a microscope so I can see that cross section. I would actually see that the skeletal muscle, the organ, is a mixture of kind of 3 different fiber types. And you can see that really clearly on the histological image on the right. So we are going to describe those 3 types in quite a bit of detail. But before we do, I want to point out that type 1 is also called slow twitch and type 2 is called fast twitch. So this lecture is really about looking at the characteristics of these 3 different fiber types. I would like you guys to pause the video and copy this table down because we're going to fill it in. All right, hopefully you guys have paused the video. So type 1, type 2a, and type 2x also go by names. Type 1 is called slow twitch. And type 2a and 2x are both called fast twitch fibers. But type 2a is called fast twitch oxidative. Whereas type 2x is called fast twitch glycolytic. Now, the phrase slow twitch and fast twitch is exactly what you think. So I am going to draw down here 2 twitches. A slow twitch fiber looks something like this. A fast twitch fiber looks something like this. Maybe even a little faster. So fast twitch fibers have a twitch length of about 10 milliseconds, and slow twitch fibers are about 10 times longer than that at 100 milliseconds. So what is determining the twitch length here? Well, remember that in this phase of the twitch, the contraction phase, we have an increased number of cross bridges. So what that tells us is that the number of cross bridges is more rapidly increasing in the blue line than the red line. And we also know that the drop, or the relaxation, is due to calcium ATPase pumping calcium back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So it looks like it probably seems to happen a little faster in the blue line as well. So for our purposes, we are only going to focus on the part of the twitch that is responsible for generating tension, the increased number of cross bridges. And the reason why fast twitch fibers generate that tension so much quicker is because they actually have a different type of myosin than slow twitch fibers do. And I'm going to demonstrate that in a moment, but for now, I'm just going to write the information down. So slow twitch fibers have slow myosin, and fast twitch fibers have fast myosin. And notice I'm calling myosin ATPase. And that is because myosin is capable of grabbing ATP and splitting it into ADP and phosphate. And so any protein that is capable of running that chemical reaction where you grab ATP and you break it apart can also be called an ATPase. So myosin is also an enzyme. It breaks ATP apart. And it can break it apart slowly, or it can break it apart quickly. Depends on which type of myosin you have. Okay, the twitch length for a type 1 is around 100 milliseconds. And for type 2, it's closer to 10 milliseconds. Okay, so now I'm going to try to demonstrate fast and slow twitch myosin. I'm going to assume that this is my actin filament or my thin filament, and my head is going to be a myosin head. So in slow twitch, it kind of goes like this. It detaches, and then it takes a while to break apart into ADP and phosphate group, and so it's like, okay, that's slow twitch. Fast twitch actually works about twice as fast, so it looks like this. So which one do you think is going to generate more cross bridges in a certain amount of time? And it's going to be the fast twitch. You have a mix of fiber types in all of your muscles. You have type 1, type 2a, and type 2x. But for our purposes right now, we're just looking at type 1 and type 2. So you have a mix of them. So type 1 was built with slow, what's called isoform myosin ATPase, the myosin that is just clunky and slow. Type 2 is built with fast myosin. You can't really interchange those. So you can't take a type 2 fiber and make it a type 1 fiber, nor can you take a type 1 fiber and make it a type 2 fiber. So that type of change really isn't possible, because it would mean that you'd have to rebuild all of your sarcomeres and rebuild all of your thick filaments with new myosin, and that's really not going to happen. So it's important to know that, because there is some training that can be done between these two. You can kind of maneuver to make your type 2 fibers more like 2X or more like 2A, but there's no training that will allow you to take a type 1 fiber and make it a type 2 fiber, or vice versa. So now that we've looked at myosin ATPase, let's come back up here to our image, and I want you to take a look at the diameter. At this point, I'm only going to focus on type 2X and type 1, and then we'll come back and look at 2A at the end. I want you to look at the diameter of a type 2X versus a type 1. Which one has a larger diameter? Type 2X, right? So type 2X actually has the largest diameter, where type 1 has the smallest. So why is that important? Well, the diameter is reflective of the number of myofibrils that's in there. The more myofibrils, the larger the diameter. The more myofibrils, the more cross bridges. So which one of these do you think is able to engage in more cross bridges during a twitch? Type 2X or type 1? Type 2X. Larger diameter equals more cross bridges. So when we talk about ability to generate tension, your type 2X fibers are the fibers that are the ones that generate the most tension. They're the ones that we think of when we talk about weightlifting, lifting your maximum weight, or even sprinting. I'll come back to that idea at the end, what these fiber types are best suited for. Okay. The other obvious thing that you might have noticed about the type 2X versus type 1 is that they have an obvious color difference. In fact, you can really see that with all three of them. Which one is the darkest colored? Type 1. Which one has the palest color? Type 2X. Why? Well, what is the color actually reflecting? Well, the darker red is reflecting something called myoglobin. And this is new, so we should introduce it here. So the prefix myo means muscle, and globin, does that look familiar to you at all? Doesn't it kind of look like hemoglobin? But it's the hemoglobin for a muscle cell. In other words, we have a large protein called myoglobin that has iron in it. So this protein is rich in iron, whose job it is to attract oxygen. and store it. So much like hemoglobin transports oxygen around the body in red blood cells, myoglobin grabs and holds oxygen in muscle fibers. And since oxidized iron is red in color, the more myoglobin you have, the redder your cell is. And the more myoglobin you have, the more oxygen storage that cell is going to have. So, using this information, we now see that yes, type 1, the slow twitch, is the darkest red. So what do you think that means for the amount of myoglobin that's in there? It's going to be the highest. So what do you think that means for the amount of oxygen that can be stored in there? It's also going to be the highest. So type 1 is usually dark red, where type 2X is very pale and almost whitish. And the color is a direct reflection of how much myoglobin is in there. So type 1 has the most myoglobin, and type 2X has the least myoglobin. So what is the advantage of holding oxygen in a muscle cell? Well, what is oxygen even used for in the body? It's used for aerobic respiration. So your ability to supply your cell with large quantities of oxygen means that cell should have the ability to do lots of aerobic respiration. And in a prior lecture from the first exam module, we learned that there are kind of two different ways that we can process glucose to get ATP. So if I have a glucose, I'm definitely going to do glycolysis, which is an anaerobic process, and then I get pyruvate, and this gives me 2 ATP. And then I take that pyruvate and I shuttle it into mitochondria, where I'm then going to do the citric acid cycle and oxidative phosphorylation. And here, oxygen is required. So this was covered in a previous set of lectures, so if this is looking foreign to you, you need to make sure you go back and rewatch those lectures. So oxygen is required for this, but the big benefit here is that you get something like an additional 32 ATP. So you get a lot more ATP going this route, but oxygen is required. So if you look at it from an efficiency model, the most efficient way to utilize your fuel or your glucose is to do aerobic respiration, which is this entire process. But if oxygen is not available or is in limited supply, then none of this happens. And the cell is basically stuck with glycolysis and then does lactic acid fermentation on the side to help glycolysis continue. And that only gives you 2 ATP. So if I have a lot of myoglobin then, hopefully it would make sense that that means I also have lots of oxygen, which means that my capacity to do aerobic respiration is actually very good. I should be able to sustain aerobic respiration over and over again. And therefore, it would behoove me to make sure that I have plenty of mitochondria to do all of that aerobic respiration. So type 1 also has the most mitochondria, where type 2X actually has very little mitochondria and also has very little oxygen. So the benefit of having a lot of oxygen and mitochondria and doing aerobic respiration over and over again is that it leads to endurance. Anybody who's done any sort of endurance athletics, so running, bicycling, swimming, triathlon, something like that, is probably familiar with some exercise physiology and the fact that if you want to go for a really long time without fatigue, you need to stay aerobic. You need to use aerobic respiration to fuel your muscles. So, those fibers that are capable of generating ATP aerobically over and over and over again also tend to have the most endurance, which means that they can keep going over and over and over again without fatigue. So how long do type 1 fibers last? Over an hour. So type 1 fibers are really well suited for repetitive actions that maybe don't require a ton of tension, nor do they require necessarily quick motion. So type 1 fibers are actually most often used for things like posture. And standing. I want you to consider what would happen if your type 1 fibers fatigued really rapidly. Right, so I'm standing upright, or I'm sitting upright here, and then my type 1 fibers that are holding my neck up and holding my back up decide to give out and I crumple on the floor. We would all just be blobs on the floor, trying to get up and falling back over because our muscles would fatigue. So it's really important that we have fibers that are able to keep going over and over and over again. But what we lose is quick bursts of very high-powered tension. In other words, strength. So while my neck muscles are just fine for holding up my head, they're not going to be the types of muscle fibers that are also going to be really instrumental in doing my personal best in the gym in terms of weightlifting. Type 2X fibers are the opposite. Type 2X fibers have basically said that their number one goal is to maximize the space for myofibrils. Mitochondria, which are actually pretty bulky, and myoglobin, which is also pretty bulky, takes up too much space. They're just going to put as many myofibrils in there as possible. So type 2X fibers are geared for maximum tension, but because they really can't do very much aerobic respiration, they don't have the mitochondria, nor do they have the oxygen supply. They rely on glycolysis for their ATP, which means that they burn through their fuel really quickly, and they have very low endurance. So what type of endurance are we talking about here? Seconds. They last seconds before they start to decrease in the amount of tension they can put out. So type 2X fibers also have the least amount of endurance. So type 2X fibers are going to be used for strength training and sprinting. Again, maximizing strength at the expense of endurance, where type 1 is maximizing endurance at the expense of strength. Type 2A fibers tend to have a little more endurance and a little less strength than type 2X fibers. And moreover, type 2A fibers can be trained to be more like type 2X or more like type 1. They're never going to be type 1, but they can be more. You can train them to have more endurance, or you can train them to have more strength at the expense of endurance. So let's briefly go through the type 2A characteristics. The diameter of the fiber is usually intermediate. I know it didn't really look like that on the picture that I showed you, but in reality it tends to be more intermediate. The tension is also intermediate. The color is pinkish. And all of this is going to vary, but it's usually going to be in between these. All right, let me show you the book's picture. Go ahead and pause and linger on this a little bit. Okay, I just want to reiterate that there is a trade-off between endurance and tension. So if you are a muscle fiber who is geared for endurance, you're not going to have the maximum amount of strength because you're going to dedicate a lot of your space to making sure that you have enough mitochondria and enough myoglobin, and that your needs are not so great, that you can use aerobic respiration over and over and over again and keep those muscles in the aerobic zone so that they don't go into the anaerobic zone and end up causing fatigue. So we'll be looking at that idea a little bit more in subsequent lectures, the idea of fatigue and anaerobic and aerobic metabolism fueling muscles. And that concept should be reinforced in the subsequent lectures. So let's talk a little bit about type 2A. Type 2A is really just another type 2 muscle fiber. So it's fast twitch, and it's really, at its basic level, designed for tension. But it can be more easily trained to be aerobic or anaerobic depending on your needs. So if you are somebody that does very little endurance activity, like running, but you go into the gym a lot and you lift weights, then you are going to favor tension over endurance. You are going to train your type 2A muscles to be more like type 2X muscles, which means, muscle fibers, which means that you are going to take your type 2A fibers and you're going to add in more myofibrils and more cross bridges to increase tension, but that means you're also going to say less mitochondria, less myoglobin, etc. So they're going to fatigue faster. If instead you decide to train for a marathon, then your muscles may actually get smaller. If you've ever seen Olympic marathon runners, they're not bulky. They're the muscles are definitely strong but more stringy. But boy, can they go for a very long time. So endurance is favored. In that case, you're simply going to take those muscles and you're going to focus on adding mitochondria and adding myoglobin and adding more blood vessels to the area so that you can have more oxygen, more aerobic respiration, and therefore more endurance. I'd like to return to the name oxidative versus glycolytic. Fast-twitch oxidative fibers are named because they are more likely to do oxidative phosphorylation, which is part of aerobic respiration. Fast-twitch glycolytic fibers use predominantly glycolysis and not aerobic respiration as their main way to generate ATP. So one other interesting thing. When you take a cross-section of your muscle, the proportion that is type 1 versus type 2 is genetic. So you can actually do a 23andMe test, and it will tell you whether or not your muscle fibers tend to be more on the type 2 side or the type 1 side. I've done 23andMe, and it told me that my muscles were more on the type 2 side. That is to say, I don't have natural endurance. But with some work, I generate pretty bulky muscles. So it's kind of interesting to see that that was genetically, fixed for me. Okay, so that's going to conclude this lecture that looks at muscle fiber types. In our next lecture, we are going to look at energy use in the skeletal muscle fibers. I'll see you then.